the reason I love science when it comes to the spirituality stuff is that with science, you have to show you're working. You have to kind of lay out in public and have other people scrutinize it and be open to criticism and open to feedback. It's that fundamental openness that shows you're not hiding anything. You're not pulling any tricks. In spirituality, people often talk about like light and love and all this like illumination stuff, which is, good terminology for what's involved in bringing awareness to one's mind. But also science is also a kind of illumination. It's a shedding light, being open to scrutiny and feedback. It's not surprising to me that science and spirituality go together nicely, that the more we discover about the brain and the self and how it's constructed, it fits with ancient wisdom. And in ancient times, perhaps it wasn't necessary to have science. But at this point, people are understandably, they need a bit more reassurance that there's no kind of nonsense going on. So yeah, I think it's an exciting time for the science and spirituality.
James, I'm a sucker for symmetry, and I love the way you said that in your book, The Dawn of Mind, how matter became conscious and alive. You set it out into two parts, inside out, which is the philosophy of science, and outside in, the science of consciousness. The philosophy of consciousness, and outside in, the science of consciousness. And I love that because it's 7 chapters each, and you start off by defining concepts, which I think is always the best way to start a conversation, a book, podcast, whatever. So James, let's start. How do you define consciousness, the self, and life?
Yeah, start with easy questions. So consciousness, you kind of have to gesture towards it, really. We can't really give a hard definition. A popular definition, which I like, is Thomas Nagel's idea that it's like something. If it's like something to be something, then it's conscious. So if we think a rock, if I were to scramble all your atoms and rearrange them into a rock, if the lights went out, if there was no experience, no feeling, then you wouldn't be conscious. Whereas if you think another person isn't a robot, isn't some inert mechanism that has no feeling, then they're conscious. So you can also see here that I'm gesturing towards other definitions like feeling, experience. Fundamentally, it's something very simple. It's the ability to take in the blue of the sky, to know, to recognize there's a sound of my voice in this moment, the fact the lights are on. So those are the best ways I can kind of gesture towards it. And it's something that is the most intimate thing for any of us, because it's the capacity to experience anything. So something's conscious if it's not an inert mechanism where nothing happens experientially. Then with life, it seems to me that life is, famously, we haven't come to a kind of universally accepted definition of life. To me, life is characterized by a living thing is something that's kind of holistically integrated. It's a whole that's kind of more than the sum of its parts, and that can function in a way it has the autonomy or the agency to act in order to avoid death, to self-perpetuate. Those are the key features for me. So it's a self-persisting pattern in reality. There are other things that persist for a time, like whirlpools, tornadoes, but life has this autonomy, this agency, where it can set goals and can then take steps to change its circumstances to keep itself going. So there's an extra level there of self-persistence, where there's some kind of level of recursion where it can actively engage in that. So if when you drained your bath, the whirlpool managed to reach up and turn the tap on to keep the water gradient flowing, that would be the kind of thing that life does. Humans have spread out to new environments and found new ways to live, and that kind of autonomy. What was the third thing you wanted a definition of?
Self.
Self is the hardest to define, because it's I actually don't think it really exists as a thing. But it's, when we use that word, the thing that we think exists is, the best way to point to it is if you say something like, who is aware of these words right now? What is the me? Who is the one that is aware? And in many spiritual traditions, particularly Buddhism, lays this out very clearly. And also Advaita Vedanta in Hinduism, when you look for that self, you can discover it's not an actually existing thing. That where you expect to find the self, you actually find a kind of an openness, you could say, or a boundlessness or a freedom. And that's where this connects with spirituality and the actual possibility of unburdening one's suffering. And yeah, so it's almost like you start with that question, who am I? And then you look for the who, or you look for the I, and then it gets replaced with just the question, just the opening, the curiosity. And there can be that discovery that it might be more accurate to say that that's what you are, is that open curiosity, rather than some solid self.
We'll touch on the illusory self more in just a moment, but I like the fact in the book you go through what you call the view from a dead end, and you manage to explain consciousness, all the various versions of it. What is your philosophical understanding of the mind-body problem, and how have you framed this over the years, and has it changed over time?
Yeah, so it hasn't changed that much, I think. I guess it only changed in its subtleties in terms of when a solution became clear to me, I started to really see clearly what was wrong with the assumptions. I think before that I was carrying some assumptions and I had to interrogate them as the kind of solution I'm offering came into view. So the way I would articulate it now is to say that so when in modern times, when people started being concerned with the gap between matter and mind, I can't remember who it was a famous philosopher who spoke about this example of if you walked inside a mill, like you imagine this a mill that's powered by water turning a turbine, and then it moves structures inside, purely mechanical, things moving in three-dimensional space, material objects. And they were saying if you expanded a human body and you walked around inside it, you walked inside the brain, and you saw all these parts moving, where are you going to find experiences? Where are you going to find the taste of coffee, the blue of the sky, the feeling of love? And so that, I think that is the kind of modern formulation where you have a kind of Newtonian view of the physical world as objects moving in space, physical things like a turbine or an atom, and they move around, and that's what's real. And so this is reductionism, the idea that those things, it's kind of materialism and reductionism. There is a material substance called matter, and it moving around in space is what's most real. And we also see this with Laplace, the idea that the totality of existence is just, if you knew all the positions of the atoms unfolding, you would know everything about existence. So in that picture, if that's what you think reality is, and then you have the experience of the taste of coffee, what story are you going to tell? So to me, the gap is between storytelling. We have one story of matter, and then we have story of mind, taste of coffee, blue of the sky. And those stories don't play nice together because they seem to be immaterial. The taste of coffee doesn't seem to be an object moving around in three-dimensional space that can be captured by Newton's laws of motion, So, and this is an important point, the gap isn't, there is a gap between the world in itself and our maps of it, or our experience of it. We should never expect our maps of the world to swallow up reality itself. And sometimes people can think that's what the gap is that we're trying to cross. But to me, the gap is in our storytelling, our understanding. We want our understanding of the world to cohere. And so, those stories don't play nicely together. And so I offer a different story, which is based around a kind of relational worldview, where I think if you see matter as relationship and you see consciousness as relationship, those stories play very nicely together. They're just extensions of the same story. So that's the kind of solution I offer.
And you call this solution a almost a biopsychic theory of consciousness.
Right.
You want to perhaps jump straight into that, because I think it's important to sort of define this concept for people in case they don't really capture this essence of a relational theory of consciousness. So I argue in the book for biopsychism this idea that this was a term coined by Ernst Haeckel in the early 20th century. And interestingly, he wasn't actually a biopsychist, he was a panpsychist. But he tried to lay out a kind of taxonomy of different positions one might hold. As I was doing this in the book, I went through different positions, and I realized chemopsychism is something I've never heard about, but it should probably be on the table. The idea that maybe organic, maybe molecules are where it's at, but for some reason, no one's ever really, as far as I know, no one's ever suggested that. You have panpsychism that maybe atoms are, and I'm saying biological systems, but not something in between. So my commitment to biopsychism came out of this relational view, because we can get into the physics of it later, but for now we can just say that there is a mainstream interpretation of physics that sees matter as relationship,
they're not seeing atoms or subatomic particles as solid, locally real things. And actually, physicists won the Nobel Prize a few years ago for discovering that particles are not locally real. So they're not these actually pre-existing material objects that are just there to be looked at. We are part of the web of interactions that is the physical world. So this is not some fringe, weird, stance. And Carlo Rovelli is one of the leading proponents of this relational view, a leading physicist. So I think this is rather a kind of mainstream vision that's coming into view rather than something fringe. So then if you see experience, consciousness as relationship, for me, it's the way that the organism interacts with its environment. It's the feeling out in the world. That is what consciousness is. It's that dynamic. And so on a more, you could say on a more kind of metaphysical level, you could say, if you zoom out to the whole picture of existence, because obviously we are an emanation, we are a manifestation of existence, we are fully part of the universe. You could say more poetically that through life, the universe comes to know itself. We are the kind of the leading edge of knowledge in the universe. We are the eyes with which the universe sees. So I think this is also why, in the book, I point towards kind of synthesizing science and spirituality, because with this view, it's a linchpin where you can go one direction and you can tell a very scientific, grounded story about organisms and brains and eyes and sensation and just how we think of experiences depending on the physical organism in a very conventional way. But then you can also understand why it is that you can use consciousness to zoom out to this more unitive oneness kind of vision, and they don't contradict each other. But I think if you move away from life as being this point of relationship, and then you want to somehow confine consciousness to the brain or to the nervous system, that act of separation, when people think it's something to do with the brain, a common view is computational functionalism, the idea that it must be something that's kind of substrate independent, some computation that's running on the brain, and that's a whole kind of can of worms that people haven't been able to figure out how that could possibly work. And whereas I think you just avoid those problems if you go with this embodied view of life as being the point of contact. That's another way of talking about consciousness. It's a kind of point of contact between one part of reality and another part of reality.
When I think about, at some point you talk about the human exceptionalism, and I also found that fascinating. When I wrote my dissertation, it was something I focused on quite a bit, how we're so obsessed with this our perception and how much value we place in this. And it's very apparent. I mean, we've always done this throughout history. If we look at the more we learned about the heart as a pump, we started to look at things very much as pumps and water systems. Right. Then slowly electricity comes through. We've got computational models of consciousness at this point, Bayesian brains. It's very difficult for humans to escape this view. Why do you think that is?
And I think the human exceptionalist kind of instinct to think that we're at the center of everything and we're important. I think, well, first thing to say is that we're not as rational as we would hope we are. Perhaps, rationality is a wonderful thing, and it's I love it, but it's built on top of a huge kind of ocean of emotional instinct. We are, and we see this has been cashed out kind of thoroughly in neuroscience, that our decision making is shaped a lot by emotion, and as systems that want to survive, want to focus on ourselves to some extent, there's like a balance between collaboration and competition in nature, how systems survive. And I think in certain situations that selfish, me-focused instinct just plays out, and it's playing out at a kind of cultural level, I think, where there's a sense of we want to focus on ourselves and see the rest of nature as separate. So, I go in the book about the modern scientific worldview, and the modern kind of industrial technological civilization came out of a very specific time in European culture. And that can be contrasted with indigenous cultures where there's a lot more kind of reciprocity with the natural world, not a sense of superiority and of domination. And so I think I also even go in the book to the kind of history and speculate about things like the plague and conflict and stuff like that. I think can lead people into a more egoic, self-focused, or even whole cultures into modes of like things are bad and we need to get power. We need to empower ourselves to survive. And I think those kinds of dynamics play out, in different cultures and lead to these behaviors of human exceptionalism and ways of seeing the world. But as indigenous cultures point to, they don't have to be there. We can move on from them, and I think it's more. We saw with Galileo that we're not at the center of our solar system, and we saw with Darwin that we're not fundamentally different from other living things. I think consciousness is the last holdout for, well, surely with experience we're special. It seems funny to me that people would put experience as the thing that we're special at, because clearly we're very intelligent. That may be what we're truly exceptional at. But like the ability to see the blue of the sky or to feel pain is like, feels such a primordial sensory thing to me that it seems odd that you would claim a worm can't feel anything, or that I mean, lots of people even get uncomfortable with any insects or even mammals that are kind of simpler than us. But that's where we're at. I think that we're clinging on to something special, some narrative that we're unique and special in some way.
You touched on something very important in that culturally it's been very different. I mean, you mentioned Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, and it's very clear that, I mean, every YouTube comment section or comment section in general, you'll find a Buddhist or someone practicing Hinduism, Advaita Vedanta, who will bring up the fact that for years now they've been thinking this. This is something that they've always been talking about. Do you think that, well, obviously at the time they did not have the scientific method to sort of put this all together into a great framework with high explanatory power. But do you think we're reaching a point where a lot of these ancient concepts coming together with these modern techniques, we're able to guide mysticism and spirituality in a more scientific manner that allows people to have a more open mind to this?
Yeah, so I would say that's the hope that drives me, or rather than the hope, the instinct to try to actualize that, to make that a reality, because I do believe there's a there. There's like it's one thing to have someone who has deep insight and has wisdom to share, but then sits on their throne and just says, just trust me that my experience is different to yours. And then you get into all the kind of gross power dynamics and abusive stuff that you see like gurus. And so we saw all that play out in the late 20th century. And I think a lot of people are fed up with that. A lot of people don't, and the thing that, always drove me is, by temperament, I'm the kind of person who would run 100 miles from any of that stuff. I'm not interested in the aesthetics of it, or the kind of the vibe of that kind of thing. And so I've discovered for myself the reality of states of consciousness that are free from suffering. And so there is this desire to be like, okay, well, how can we? The reason I love science when it comes to the spirituality stuff is that with science, you have to show you're working. You have to kind of lay out in public and have other people scrutinize it and be open to criticism and open to feedback. It's that fundamental openness that shows you're not hiding anything. You're not pulling any tricks. You're not, and so it's like, in spirituality, people often talk about like light and love and all this like illumination stuff, which is good terminology for what's involved in bringing awareness to one's mind. But also science is also a kind of illumination. It's a shedding light. It's like, light being the kind of best disinfectant in terms of being open to scrutiny and feedback. And more and more people are doing this. I think if we can flesh out, it's not surprising to me that science and spirituality go together nicely, that the more we discover about the brain and the self and how it's constructed, it fits with ancient wisdom around this. And in ancient times, perhaps it wasn't necessary to have science, but at this point, people understandably, they need a bit more reassurance that there's no kind of nonsense going on. I think it's an exciting time for the synthesis of science and spirituality.
I agree. I think that it's a lot more scientists are less afraid of the L word, love. And talking about it seems to be a lot more easier for them. But there was a time where I can clearly remember people just avoiding this altogether. Now you've got serious scientists talking about things like teleonomy, purpose, meaning. Well, how do you see the purpose and meaning of the universe?
Yeah, so interestingly, one of the ways I see science and spirituality matching up, you could say the kind of what I mean when I talk about spirituality is is discovering non-separation, really discovering that you're not this separate self, something that needs to struggle with existence, that you can discover your deeper nature to just be beingness, the same thing as the rest of existence. And when you kind of let go into that, purpose and meaning actually fall away, and they're seen to be constructs, like they're a core part of being a living thing. I mentioned before, living things as being kind of goal-directed, oriented towards the fundamental goal of staying alive, and then you scaffold other goals and purpose on top of that. But when you let go into a kind of a deeper level, reality feels like play, and play doesn't have a purpose. It's a kind of a fundamental. It feels like you discover that all that exists is a kind of cosmic creative principle of just purposeless play, and that's really liberating. It's meaningless in the most wonderful way, because meaning's a real burden. Like thinking that you really have to like get this right. That is the burden of meaning making and purpose. So that's always been my orientation. Now, if someone were to kind of point out that, as I said before, we are fully part of the universe and we exhibit purpose, so isn't there something there around the universe showing purpose? That hasn't been my orientation, and I'm wary around it because the self structure that mediates suffering so badly wants to cling on to its struggle and to its purpose. That so I often just kind of sidestep that and think and point in this direction of letting go of purpose. But I'm open to the possibility that there could be like maybe a synthesis on offer there, where there's some validity to seeing the universe that way. But typically, I think purpose is something that exists in our minds, and that is actually a burden that is good to be liberated from, and that the universe doesn't need to be going anywhere. You could say it's a vision of circularity where, there isn't really progress or any meaningful destination. It's just the play in the present moment.
At some point, you mentioned demystifying mysticism. Is that really possible?
Yeah, it's funny because language, again, with a core aspect of spirituality as well, is seeing that reality is non-conceptual. Concepts arise through language, and they serve to seemingly divide up the world into different objects. And so when you see this, again, I mentioned the map is not the territory, that our ideas about reality are not reality itself. And so when you see that, you see language for what it is, which is that no word has any inherent meaning. They only have meaning relative to other things. And again, that's that relational relativity point. So even in this sense, even in the words I'm saying now, you're seeing how this is pointing to other things in the conversation, and it's that pointing to seeing how the web of everything connects with each other. There is only that interdependent relationship. There is no actual kind of. If you think you know what the word sun means, and you can point to the sun, even that is like the sun doesn't have any inherent essence apart from how all the other processes of nature that kind of come together for it to exist in that moment. So this is the Buddhist concept of emptiness, which is the flip side of relationality, is that nothing actually has. Through object perception, we imbue things with a sense of like, oh, I know what the sun is. This is the sun. It's like an object. But actually, once you start to interrogate and deconstruct it, you see that there is only existence coming together in that moment. The sun wouldn't be the sun if you took away, the vacuum around it of space and everything. Yeah, it needs everything to be what it is. I've rambled away from your initial question now. Can you remember what the question was?
It fits in perfectly with what you talk about as the epistemic space within beliefs and how they arise. Right. Everything should be taken into a context. I mean, there's certain things, when we talk about certain things, we obviously know that nothing lives in a vacuum. Everything is contextual, relational. And earlier you mentioned bringing in the physics of this, and you call this living mirrors. And I love the way you brought in a lot of these very, very scientific physical concepts into describing and discussing how this embodied or predictive brain can do what it does and how it then eventually leads to your theory. Before we start and touch on to that, I want to just make sure, for anyone who thinks that this is a panpsychist theory, well, how would you differentiate this from that?
Right. Yeah. So that goes back to the limits of language, because so at the very end of the book, I basically say how you could tell the same story with different words, and you could claim it to be a panpsychist story in some sense with some caveats, or an idealist story with all with caveats, or a physicalist story, or even an illusionist story where consciousness is an illusion in some sense. Because the map is not the territory, you can have different maps and they're all offering different insights. So I could tell this story where, like, what I could say is the physics of life that I think is consciousness or underpins consciousness, that same physics exists in some form in any self-organizing system, an atom, anything that persists over time. Now, it doesn't show, is precisely because it doesn't show the autonomy and the preference for avoiding death. I think that's where meaning comes in, because the first thing of significance is that you don't want to die, and everything else is scaffolded on top of that. An atom shows no evidence of caring or having any ability to orient away from its own destruction. Like, we don't worry about the ethics of particle colliders, smashing particles into each other. If you did it with squirrels, then we would worry about the ethics of that. That's because they act in such a way that suggests they don't want to die. And so I think there's experience there. So what you could say, though, is that, well, there's a continuity here, and this is very kind of recent in the last few years, emerging physics out of the free energy principle that's being called kind of Bayesian mechanics at this point. And you could think of it as a kind of scale-free physics of forms, where Darwin had this insight that the complex forms of species, like the giraffe, of the length of a giraffe's neck matching up with the length of the trees in its environment, there's information carried in the length of the giraffe's neck about the height of the trees in that environment, in the sense that information is uncertainty reduction. So if I wanted to know the height of a tree on an island where some giraffes lived, I could measure the length of the giraffe and come up with a pretty good guess about the height. And so there's some correspondence there. I can reduce my uncertainty about the trees by measuring the giraffe. So there's some information there. So in those physical structures, the same thing happens with any physical form. And this is kind of universal Darwinism, where, so for example, if you imagine a bank of sand that forms an island in the middle of the ocean, imagine somewhere very shallow like the Maldives or something, where the sands are shifting around, and it would be unlikely that sand would naturally form into a really tall box shape with sharp edges. That instinctively would look weird, because we know that the waves would weather that away, right? And it would become a kind of slope. So the slope of that island will come to mirror the slope of, say, there's like a huge deep trench next to the island. That will shape the shape of the island, even though the trench and the island never come into direct contact. There's this resonance that happens through the waves shifting. So in the same way that the selection algorithm of evolution shapes the shape of the giraffe's neck to match the height of the trees, without the trunk of the tree and the giraffe's neck never directly interact in some Newtonian physical way, but this resonance happens where the forms come to fit their niche. And so the form of the island comes to fit its niche of the surrounding landscape. And this is the same thing that life does in every moment through sensation and perception, moment to moment to survive. We're doing this kind of process. And inference, it turns out that Darwinian selection process is the same thing as inference. This is where the information thing comes in, that the height of the neck of the giraffe is the same as corresponds in some sense to the height of the trees. So with life, we're leveraging that information to survive. And I think that's where the kind of ability to simulate a world outside of ourselves and use that to navigate comes in. So to come back to bring this full circle, the atom carries information about the world around it. It has that resonance structure that is the kind of relationship that is the physics that consciousness, I think, is scaffolded on, or consciousness is an elaboration of that physics. So you could be generous and call it proto-consciousness, but you'd have to be careful to say, I don't think there's any reason to think there's meaning, significance, and as a result, I think there's probably not any qualitative character to it. But it's a story where you can point to a deep continuity between the physical and the mental, which is what the instinct of panpsychism is, that this can't just kind of spring out of absolutely nothing with an absolute discontinuity. And that's right, there is a physics of forms that goes from atoms all the way up to the universe as a whole. And some people want me to then speculate that maybe the universe as a whole could be a mind, which nothing in physics that says that couldn't be the case, but I just don't see any reason to kind of come to that conclusion at this point.
There's all the work you mentioned, it sort of links well with certain thinkers and people who've been on this podcast before, people like Mark Solms, Carl Friston, Mike Levin. How much of their work has really influenced the way you think today?
Yeah, all three of those people are cited extensively in the book because, yeah, you're right. There's like an emerging, I'm not kind of setting out a stall that's like a million miles from everyone else. That's kind of like, here's my unique idea about consciousness. And what I'm trying to do is synthesize our best understanding. So I think those people are really at the leading edge of, yeah, they're all doing incredible work. Yeah, so it fits very, very neatly. I also would say, I think Terence Deacon as well, who I think you've spoken to on the podcast, I think his work really points in the same direction. He coined this term teleodynamics that I really like, which really points to when you ask, why life, why do I think life experiences and non-life doesn't, or what is life? I think teleodynamics is a really good term for it, which means purposive dynamics set towards a goal, which in this case is self-persistence, the avoidance of death. So yeah, I think his work, which I cite in the book as well, is really useful in this domain.
I'm actually we're setting up a conversation with Terence Deacon and Michael Levin. We're having some.
Oh, amazing!
Yes,
that'd be great. I'll definitely listen to that.
Yeah. So, but is it looking forward to that? Is that about their work specifically that? Well, I might even bring it up as a question for them that you find particularly fascinating.
Sorry, I coughed over that. Was there anything about their work in particular?
About Mike Levin, Terence Deacon's work that you'd like me to ask them in that conversation?
Yeah, I'll probably have a think about it because that's a great opportunity. They've both contributed so much. I mean, Michael Levin's churning. I mean, I think it was just yesterday I saw an amazing preprint with Chris Fields he put out, and is putting out so much all the time. And Terence Deacon's Incomplete Nature is such a like tour de force of detail. Like it's the most, I would say it's the most detailed book I've ever read in terms of like sentence after sentence. It's like there's so much in there. So I don't think off the top of my head I'll do it justice. But I think I'll definitely listen because, as I say, I think Terence's way of looking at the emergence of morphodynamics, the emergence of forms, and then teleodynamics. I mean, I guess I would like it if, well, I was going to say I'd like it if someone like Carl Friston was involved in that conversation as well, or John Campbell's. I mean, he doesn't really do podcasts, but he's someone who writes about universal Darwinism and the way that inference, the free energy principle, those dynamics are the same thing as the Darwinian selection algorithm. And this kind of Bayesian mechanics, physics of forms thing, I think is a crucial piece of the puzzle. Terence hasn't spoken about that as far as I know. Michael Levin definitely incorporates active inference, Carl's stuff. So I guess I'd be interested in that. Is like, to what extent do they both see the free energy principle, active inference, or more like, I should say, Bayesian mechanics and a physics of form, scale-free physics of forms as being crucial to understanding the mind? Yeah, that'll probably be my question.
Someone who also cited your book is Mark Solms, and he's from Cape Town. I just love talking about Mark's work because it's so close to home for me. But
yeah.
Something he often touches about is the ancient aspect of the brain and the fact that we're also obsessed with this cortical fallacy, and we need to get out of thinking. I mean, we think it's a very, as we touched on earlier, this exceptionalism. Does consciousness, or is consciousness possible without brains?
So I think in humans, probably not, because I think Mark's instinct that the brainstem, the structures that are absolutely crucial to the living body, are important for consciousness is right. He calls it the hidden spring. But the thing I would differentiate is that for me, it's not, you don't need a brain for consciousness to come into existence. So you could say the simplest takeaway of my book, I guess there are two. There's the science of spirituality being compatible, but then scientifically, the simplest thing is that we currently think, if you go through the history of the universe, that nervous systems or brains, some event in the development or evolution of those structures brought experience into existence, brought consciousness into existence. And I'm saying, I think it came to existence with life. And the first life forms didn't have nervous systems. And, we're all these kind of electrical, self-organizing systems. And so you could say, well, is it possible for a body with like electrical activity in it to experience? And I would say, well, absolutely, that's what the brain is. The brain is just biological tissue that can kind of mediate electrochemical signaling, and it's not unique in that sense. Every cell deals with electrical gradients, and I go to great pains. I'm a neuroscientist. I trained in neuroscience because I really thought I bought into the paradigm that the brain is where it's at. Like, you don't have to worry about single-celled organisms; they're just little reflex machines. if you want to understand minds, don't look for it there. And this, Michael Levin's work really comes in here as well. Although interestingly, he even goes beyond life to think that there's kind of diverse embodiments of minds that we just don't even recognize, which is interesting. I had him on my podcast, and he was talking about the idea that you can't even assume that the weather doesn't have cognition, which is outside the way I think about this stuff, but definitely very fascinating.
There's so much that they're working on at this point. I mean, when I look at the output, him, Chris Fields, there's this group of people. I call them the Avengers of Mind. Just they're literally pumping out paper after paper and collaborating so much that it's quite difficult to start separating a panpsychist from an idealist from a physicalist at this point, because they're all sort of converging into this beautiful hive mind in a sense. What's your opinion?
Yeah, no, I think this points to the. I agree that the empty, non-conceptual, relational nature of reality means that we should be able to have people say, "I'm going to use this idealist language, and I'm going to use this physicalist language," and actually we're saying the same thing. I like to kind of differentiate my position from idealism, because I don't think it's as simple as everything is, there's just mind, it's a mind-only picture of reality, and everything's just in it. And mind, we don't know why mind exists. It's just here. Like, and mind is some kind of substrate or substance. Like, that's not how I think about things. But then when I unpack my vision, I'm like, I think it's this. There's a consciousness researcher called Max Velmans, whose view he calls reflexive monism, and I think his view might be even the same as mine, or very similar. We're going to speak soon, so I'll be reading more of his stuff. But I think that idea of monism, there is only one thing in existence, but there's a reflexivity. There's the way that the universe comes to know itself, and I think that's through life. He talks about brains and stuff. But yes, I think it's that reflexivity. Yet we are, as I said, the kind of the leading edge of the rest of the universe. We're like a wave in the universe. We're not separate from it. So you can talk about you can wake up to a kind of a cosmic principle of consciousness where it's like, even though it's only in us, we are, fully part of the rest of the universe. It's like if the tip of Mount Everest, the summit, was convinced it was only the summit, and it wasn't actually part of the rest of Mount Everest, or it wasn't even part of the Himalayas. It was truly separate. And then suddenly it has this experience of seeing its entire continuity with, it's like, well, actually, I'm a bit of the Himalayas. I'm fully part of the Himalayas. That's what these kind of experiences are like. You don't suddenly start seeing from a different perspective. You can still be on the relative level of the summit. You can still be this body, but you're also everything else, So you can have these experiences of kind of cosmic consciousness, even though I don't think we need to think of experiences somehow actually expanding out of the body, or, existing at a cosmic scale. But I don't think there is any material substance in the world. I think Berkeley, who is the kind of most famous idealist in the West, I think he actually originally called his position immaterialism, and my position is immaterialism in the sense that there isn't the thing we call the physical. Is just patterns in reality, and mind is also patterns. So I think especially with kind of subtle versions of like German idealism and stuff, I suspect in many ways I am an idealist, but just not in the kind of the simple view where that's quite popular in some spaces now, where it's like there's only the one mind, the cosmic consciousness. But yeah, so the reason I'm saying this is, sometimes I'll be at pains to emphasize I'm not an idealist, but in some cases there are idealists who I think would just be like, oh, your view's exactly the same as mine. And so you have to really appreciate the limits of language.
Yes, I think there's many cases where this happens, where I see maybe an illusionist explaining their view, and it fits so perfectly with a panpsychist view. So and vice versa. There's various times where this happens on the podcast as well, where someone might say they're an illusionist, but their next step would be the complete opposite. So their second view would be the complete opposite, which is interesting to show how we struggle with linguistic concepts and trying to explain these complex phenomena. When I spoke to Noam Chomsky about this, I asked him if language plays an important role with our limitations of explaining these concepts, and he said no. Just pointed out, said no. But then I've had many others on the show who say that this is in essence the fundamental problem. How do you see language playing a huge role in this, in discussing the mind and consciousness?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting, because I think language plays language has its same limitations when we even discuss a cup or any object, like the most mundane things in the physical world. But we fall into this. We have this. We all share similar. Most of us share similar kind of brain structures and ways of perceiving the world. So we all have this shared narrative of what a cup is, as something, a vessel that we can drink from, and so we categorize it as something familiar and mundane that other people are going to reinforce in our perception of the world, and so we don't question it. But actually, if we start to deconstruct it, like the ship of Theseus, where you see that actually a cup, if I'm in a pottery class and I make a cup and I gradually change the shape to a flat disc, at what point does it stop being a cup? We can see with that actually the definition is entirely functional. It's like, can I drink from it? Can I have this relationship? If I cup my hands and drink water from it, and my hands now a cup, they are like it. We, in a sense, but also, so what you can see here, is that the overlay of perception and language is not what's going on in reality itself. But when we see this, it kind of invites us to stop grasping and stop holding on to reality, because that's what we do with our perception, is we try and reify it and make it feel solid and stable. So people often get uncomfortable when things start to dissolve and you realize that reality isn't as you thought it was. But then with experience, it's so what I think the difference is with experience is that it's so tangible and concrete and here, that like with a cup or an atom or something, you can fall into the fallacy of thinking that your map is the territory. You're not being confronted with atoms all the time. So if you tell yourself a story that Newtonian mechanics has got it right and that's everything there is to know, and all done, like say this is 18th century or 19th century and before quantum mechanics, you could just convince yourself that's the you have the whole picture of what's going on. I've totally lost my thread of thought then. I can't even remember what I was talking about.
Yeah, well, so we're discussing how easily language can mislead us because of
language. Thank you. Yeah. So you mistake your language, your map for the territory, and you think your Newtonian mechanics story is reality. But with experience, it's so here that like you can't make that same mistake. I can tell you a story, but it's never going to make the taste of coffee disappear, because it's so imminent and right here. So that can be partly, I said at the beginning that we expect, some people kind of instinctively, I think, expect our models to jump off the page and consume the territory. Like that's almost what we want out of it. If we're not aware of the map territory distinction, it's almost like we want our physics story to be so good that we can forget about physics and we can just be done with it. Some people have the same thing where I think on some level they almost want like, there's some existential anxiety where they want the consciousness theory to basically swallow up consciousness and be done with it. And this, I don't know if this makes sense to people, but I think this is that's why there's this neurosis where it's like, I can't explain away my experience. And this leads us into the kind of mystical experiences and spirituality, where when you settle into that feeling, you can discover that you actually exist, that there is beingness that's beyond words. But again, that involves an opening, a surrender that the mind typically doesn't want to do.
In your book, you mentioned those folk psychological intuitions, and you talk about separation, self, and substance.
Right.
At what point in your life did you move beyond these concepts and see beyond these concepts? Because these seem to be things that we construct as subjective experiences rather than objective ontological entities.
Yeah, so I point to the kind of mystical experience, or what's called awakening in Buddhism, as this kind of shift where you go from thinking you live in a world of separate objects and that you are one of those objects, to discovering the unnameable wholeness of being, you could say. And then when that happens, the way I lay out in the book, as you say, is to say that I think self, substance, and separation are key aspects of this. So self is going from thinking you are a thing that inhabits the body, maybe in the brain, maybe you are the brain, maybe you're a soul, something that inhabits the body, to discovering that you are beingness in this form, you are the energy of existence in this form, with a narrative that you are a self, that's only a narrative, a story, or a way of perceiving. Along with that is a sense of being a separate thing, that you are distinct from the rest of the world. You are not at home in the universe. You are kind of alienated and small. You are confined to this material body, and therefore death is a big problem. Whereas if you identify with beingness, death isn't a problem, because where are you going to go? Because you are beingness. Wherever there's beingness, that's you. So this is what kind of happens with these experiences. So, and then substance is seeing emptiness, really, seeing that the world isn't made of solid material building blocks. It's a flux, a kind of an eternal, yeah. People often talk about energy in spirituality, and I think that the fact that matter and energy are the same thing is a useful way, perhaps, of pointing to this. That reality is fluid, it's insubstantial, it's occurrences. I often kind of think of energy as just the potential for something to happen, for a kind of an event to occur. So this is kind of like a process metaphysics where there isn't really anything there. There's just a relationship of the one empty potency of existence interacting with itself. So this is kind of how it feels with this kind of shift. And they all kind of came in one go for me when I was ruminating on hell as a teenager, and then my mind kind of hit a dead end, and I suddenly stopped thinking. And then everything I'm pointing to in terms of the simplicity of just the wholeness of reality and language being insufficient, and then not being a self, then not being separation or substance, like all of that's just staring you in the face, or the no face, because there's a sense of the self falling away. And I was in my early teens at that point. These insights are not cognitive. They're not mediated through thought. They're not an understanding. They're not. You don't be anything in particular to have these insights. It's like Everett. It's like the summit of Everest discovering that it's the Himalayas. It's just, you look and you're like, oh, obviously. Like as once you stop doing this fixation of like, no, I'm just the summit. I'm just the summit. I'm just this body. I'm just this body. You stop doing that, and it's like, oh, obviously, there's just what is. And it's kind of too simple to put into words. So all that kind of happened in one go. And then, as I say, it's too simple to really put into words. So then when you try to put into words, a lot can actually be said because it's all insufficient and it all points to different facets. But I think it's a shift towards seeing reality more clearly. I think it's in Buddhism, they talk about delusion a lot. And I think the usual way that we see the world is rife with these folk psychological structures that is kind of assumptions about how the world is and what we are that shape our experience, and that with these insight states you can really wake up out of that delusion into seeing reality more clearly. I think these are often insight states rather than delusional states, and that's not to say that everything everyone experiences is should just be taken for granted. If someone has a crazy experience of being abducted by aliens, I'm not saying great, we just have to say that's on the same footing as particle accelerator experiments. We need to be critical and philosophically rigorous and see where stuff fits together. But I think the core of what's called awakening is a corrective to our flawed primate mammalian biases when it comes to how we perceive the world.
Is there any part of, let's say, your spiritual practice that you wish you did not have to defend within the scientific community?
Didn't have to defend. That's interesting. Yeah.
I find it's very difficult for a lot of for many scientists who have a spiritual way of living to express it openly. There's almost this defense mechanism then. And although there's a shift occurring, how do you reconcile these two aspects of your life?
Yeah, I mean, when you say any aspect of it, it's really the whole thing. It's like I feel the resistance around it, because I mentioned before that for me it really comes down to openness versus closeness. To me, the spiritual path is a path of opening, and you could say that could begin with a moment of mindfulness where you're opening to present moment experience and you're becoming curious. Self-inquiry from Advaita Vedanta is a kind of you're inquiring into what you are. You're open. That has a kind of curiosity tone to it. It's all about surrender is a big part of it as well, and so I think it's spirituality when it's wise and not is an invitation to open and surrender and stop struggling with existence. But then as people do that, the ego, the desire to hold on, to close things down, to understand, to come up with mental models, I think goes into overdrive. So I think that's why what people think of as spirituality, which is the kind of a lot of the new agey fluff and like is actually people trying to avoid true spirituality, because true spirituality is like a radical undoing, a radical shedding of struggle, which is wonderful and liberating, but it's also painful. It's like we have our attachments and we don't want to let go of our attachments. It feels like an emotional amputation a lot of the time when you're shedding attachments. It's very much a transformative process, like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. And if you say to the caterpillar on the rational level, like, do you want to go into that chrysalis and be dissolved and like and you'll die, but then trust me, there's going to be this beautiful butterfly, and like maybe you'll never know that because the you will perish. But like the caterpillar is probably, if it was raised in our modern culture, is going to be like, I'm not so sure about this. So I think when other people point to this possibility, yeah, there can just be that resistance. And I think for a long time, there was sometimes kind of, yeah, there were feelings about that in terms of wishing, a feeling maybe not understood, or like that people project their own anxieties of like, oh, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to be like a guru? You're trying to exploit people? Like, what's your game here? Just thinking there has to be a game. It can't just be an invitation for peacefulness and openness. But then over time, I just saw that everyone is where they're at for all, due to all the causes and conditions of reality. And so like, if someone needs to resist in that moment, that's fine. Like that's where they're at. And I think science is really this opening. It takes you into the emotion space, into feeling, and the way that we avoid feeling is through the mind. And so I think science is almost the antithesis. There's a reason science and spirituality need to be synthesized, because culturally, I think our tendencies are kind of in opposite directions. If you're someone who's wants to resist, coming up with ideas and thinking, staying in the head is a really good way. It's maybe the only way or the main way to avoid this. So I think there's a bias where if you pick a random scientist and you pick a random person who's not a scientist, the scientist is probably more likely to have some resistance to spirituality, is my instinct. But yeah, at this point, I'm very accepting of just where everyone's at. And again, it's an invitation rather than a demand that people need to agree or see things this way. People are totally welcome to say what they want or kind of resist this stuff.
It reminds me of something when I spoke to Thomas Metzinger and we were discussing pure consciousness and how people can appreciate this experience. And I think they had done a study where they got a bunch of university students to participate in this. But because most of them were purely academics, it was very difficult to get them to enter this state. So it seems like almost it's the harder, the more of a, let's use the butterfly, the less of a butterfly you are, the less likely you are to become a butterfly.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because in my case, I was so deeply in my caterpillar state when this shift happened. I was almost too far, I was pushing this stuff away so far that I fell off the other end. And like, so it can happen that way. You're so invested in the mind, which is what I was just ruminating so intensely on a paradox that couldn't be solved, that I hit a dead end, and then all this stuff was kind of readily apparent. But yeah, I mean, I mentioned awareness as a key way in which you can open to this stuff. And one way you can do that is to first notice awareness as the already present space in which my words are arising. Even between the words, there's a silent, still space in which the words arise into. The lights don't go out, the lights are still on. So you can tune into that and you can notice that awareness pervades everything in experience. And then that awareness can turn on itself to know itself, to reflexively become aware of itself without you doing it. The you that thinks that is mediated through thought, this can just happen, and that you can just kind of recede into the background. The mind could even be like, this is BS, nothing's happening, whilst this amazing illumination is happening. It can feel very and so you're really letting go of that struggle of feeling like the self who needs to orient in those moments. But yeah, if you're a very intellectual person, that's probably going to make you feel uncomfortable, because you're letting go of your grip on the thing that is who you are, is like how you orient in the world. But there's nothing wrong with letting go, and not only that, it's wonderful. But it is wise to check that you know what you're doing, that you have support, and that you have a good guide, and that you're not going to be taken advantage of by some abusive guru, or so all of those things, those concerns the mind has, are totally valid and reasonable. But it's wise to channel them into growth rather than habitually staying small, which is partly what the kind of the self module in the mind wants to do. Is just, and actually the free energy principle from Carl Friston really, I think, explains this nicely, that living things can't have a God's eye view of what's the best way to live. Like, okay, I'm going to go over there and I'm going to live in this niche because that's the optimal way, and I'm going to do it this way. They have to just they have to stumble into what's good enough to keep them surviving. And then once you find a habit that works, you kind of stick with that with a bit of noise so that you can explore and see if there's something better. But there's a fundamental tendency to just keep doing what's been working to keep you going. And I think that's kind of what the self-structure does is it's like if someone's super depressed, but they've still got food, they've still got fresh drinking water, they've got shelter, the the system doesn't necessarily want them to get into. It's more concerned with the fact that they're still physically alive rather than that they're flourishing. It's like this is good enough. You're still getting food, and perhaps in a scary world, being scared and depressed and is actually a good coping mechanism, because who knows, if I live in a world where if I go and put myself out there, maybe things are gonna go bad. So yeah, I think this is another way in which all these things are kind of coming together to synthesize science and spirituality.
If someone hasn't read your book, what would be your best sales pitch for it? What would be the best you can think of that they should read this book?
Yeah, so I'm assuming with this audience they're already interested in the mind-body problem, and yeah, I'm offering what I see as a solution that synthesizes, as I say, the kind of leading thinkers' work, the leading kind of paradigms that are emerging. So it's not, even if you disagree with my conclusions, you'll get a really good primer on, actually I assume no background knowledge. I bring people along the whole way from all the issues at play and offer how I see them fitting together, but in a non-dogmatic way. You won't come away from it feeling, it's an invitation to come to your own conclusions. And I've heard from people that they felt that way when they read it, that like, yeah, they're welcome to disagree. But I think they'll get a good sense of, I think the biopsychism thing as well is an interesting thing to feel into, just to feel like, is this plausible? Could this be the case? Because there aren't that many people really offering that invitation to unpack. Michael Levin's, I think, one of them. But I mean, he's again pointing even beyond biopsychism, but just the non-neurocentric view is something that I think we need to start considering. Like, you don't to just decide I'm right about everything, but you could just be like, is this possible? And I think if we I found that inhabiting that perspective, everything started to make sense. Everything started to fall into line. And it's a bit like how before, when people thought that the Earth was at the center of the solar system, the trajectories of the planets had these crazy, wacky, loopy orbits that just didn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. And then you move the sun to the center, suddenly it's concentric circles, and it's the most elegant, simple, picture there is. And I feel like this is like that. You think the brain's at the middle, and you're like, okay, well, this doesn't add up. Everything looks weird. It's not matching up. You put life at the middle. And actually, now I'm seeing concentric circles. Now everything's falling into place. That's the kind of signal that made me feel I was on the right track, or at least that it was worth putting down my perspective, because I found it convincing in a way where, someone could try on this perspective for a while, and then they could modify it. They can move beyond it if it's flawed in some way. So that's on the, as you say, I split the book into the philosophy and the science. That's the kind of second half. But the first half is like, if you're interested on a more kind of metaphysical level, like, could reality be not what it seems, in a way where there might be a possibility to unburden your suffering, because the suffering is playing out through the mind, in a way where you're struggling in thought in a way that you don't need to. If there's any inclination that there might be something to mindfulness and Buddhism and spirituality, that perhaps there is a way to unburden your suffering. I feel like the first half of the book could give you a sense of why it's not crazy to think that, why it isn't supernatural, why it fits with science, why you don't need to believe anything crazy, to come into greater well-being.
And in your practice, well, let's try not to be one of those podcasts where you become the guru trying to tell people what to do. But in your own practice at home, what's your way of opening up to the universe and opening up your mind?
Yeah, so for me, after the initial kind of awakening as a teenager, it's like spirituality or this stuff isn't something that you can pick up and put down as like a hobby. It becomes your life. It becomes the context in which your life is playing out. So even the book and my work around it felt like the activity of this opening to try to reckon with reality, to try to understand where I'm at in reality, what's going on. So for me, that movement has always been primary, and then the other stuff is secondary. The idea is the intellectual stuff. And so I do something that, I teach this stuff now as well, and I call it surrendered inquiry when I teach it, which is that I think existence has this fundamental openness, but it's also engaged with itself. There's those kind of two aspects. It's almost like it's expanding, but it's also interacting with itself. And so you can kind of approximate that in your own mind, where you surrender in the sense that you're not trying to you're coming to rest and opening, but you're also not just like blasé, like, okay, whatever, I'm going to let anything happen. There's a tuning in, there's an inquiry where there's an inquisitiveness to what's going on, and usually what's going on is very subtle levels of suffering or separation. So there could just be a kind of scanning experience where perhaps I notice in the throat maybe there's a bit of tension, and it's like, okay, I'm going to open to that, soften it in like an embodied way. And so you're just kind of probing, looking. It's just looking, really. It's through doing that, it's an unraveling. It's like an unraveling of tension, of resistance. But this wasn't the way I practiced most of my life. This is very kind of the last few years of really fine tuning the deep stage stuff. But at the same time, that same movement is really the whole path, is an engaged, surrendered looking at experience. Yeah.
And when you named the book, it's called The Dawn of Mind: How Matter Became Conscious and Alive. Did you put a lot of thought into whether or not you should put conscious first or alive second?
That's interesting. Came alive and conscious. No, I think it came quite easily, because it was like how matter became conscious was like, that's really what it's about. But I was like, you know what, I want to signal to people the biopsychism. I don't want to just be like, I want to, yeah, and it is connected. So it came out that way. But interestingly, after I wrote the book, again, being on this science and spirituality kind of intersection, I think for the people on the spirituality side, the word matter can be alienating. And I mean, even in the book, actually, I say that I don't really think matter exists in the form of something substantial and physical. I think the physical are these patterns in reality.
Chapter 5 is what is matter, and then you address this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So the title of the book was it's always going to be flawed, and again, limits of language. But it's like I almost was just sticking with the conventional way we think about this stuff, and then take people along from that framing. So it's kind of funny to look back now after it's done and be like, yeah, there's a lot of subtleties there that I don't think I would, unless I was going to write a whole paragraph as the title, I don't think I would have been able to unpack it.
Yeah, I know, because many people, when they write a book, there's obviously working titles, and people have certain ideas here and there. Richard Dawkins had The Selfish Gene, and he wanted to call it The Immortal Gene. Was there any sort of secondary title you had for the book in mind?
Yeah, initially I think Living Mirrors was the draft title, since the living mirror theory is the theory. And but then I was like, that just once I brainstormed it a bit, and The Dawn of Mind just felt very neat and definitive, almost. Like I quite liked that, like maybe, if there's a grandparent with a grandkid who likes sciencey stuff, and they see that title, and they're like, okay, that looks like a solid science book. That's part of me that thought it was just nice to have something that feels quite definitive. And yeah.
Is there anything about Living Mirrors that you feel we haven't touched on yet, that you'd like people to sort of know and understand?
Yeah, I mean, we've done a good job, I think, of seeing the main points. The consciousness arises with life, and it's, as you spoke about at the beginning, of this relational dynamic that I think commits us to this embodied picture. And that through that understanding, you can come to see that living systems, are not fundamentally separate. They're not actually separate objects. They are processes in reality. And I spoke about this kind of fractal universal Darwinist picture, where you can then see from that, you can zoom out to see all of reality as this single process. In the beginning of the book, I go into some very speculative metaphysics about what I gestured towards a kind of cosmic creative principle, like a generative, but it's like a generative void, like a potent nothingness that I think is the generator of existence, kind of is existence. And it's through that kind of vision of, you can come to this vision of just forms blossoming out of a formless ground and falling back into it in this impermanent, interdependent flux. I think Taoism is something that really resonates with me. It feels like I'm re-articulating a kind of Taoist view. In the Tao Te Ching, so the opening lines, that the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, and the Tao just means the way. So it's kind of a gesturing towards this, the way of existence, the unnameable blossoming that is existence. And that's what you can kind of wake up to through spiritual practice. So yeah, I think we've done a good job of hitting
Have
the
you,
main notes.
have you noticed any sort of everybody who publishes a book on consciousness has some sort of pushback? What have been some of your critiques that you feel you'd like to address, if any?
Yeah, I mean it's only been out for about a month, so maybe I'm just waiting for those to really land.
It comes. It
Yeah,
does. Anyway.
yeah, I'm sure it will. I'm sure it will. Um, yeah, the main pushback I've got just in social media again is like the use of the word matter in the title, people just dismissing the book out of hand. Like again, people in the more kind of idealist, I think, end of the spectrum.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, there's not much I can do about that if they don't want to actually engage with the ideas. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's the reassurance that I tried to offer earlier. That I think if you're an idealist, I think you'd probably find this quite interesting. This book, you shouldn't assume, oh, this is I know who this is. This is some scientist who just thinks matter is matter and the consciousness is an illusion or whatever. There's an invitation there to look into it. And I think something that's been reassuring is when I've spoken to kind of colleagues and people in the neuroscience end of things, something I've heard again and again is, when I have the first conversation with them, some of them, kind of convinced, but there's typically a sense of like, okay, like I see what you're saying. That's not typically how I see it. I'll sit with it for a while. But then they'll often say something like, I don't see any like in principle reason why this can't be the case, like why it can't be the case that experience can exist without brains. And that's the heartening thing that like that's what I want people to open up to. There's nothing in philosophy, nothing in science that says that the electrical activity in non-neural biological tissue is different or that neural tissue is magical in some way, that's the crack in the armor that I want people to kind of start to open up to say like this is actually reasonable. And if it can get rid of the hard problem, then I think it's a superior explanation to clinging on to human-exceptionalism, neuro-exceptionalism, which comes with these philosophical problems that we can't seem to fix.
Yeah, I think that's this trying to escape from this ethereal essence-like entity of consciousness, trying to get away from that, has been quite a problem. Most people tend to latch onto this, and that exceptionalism is a big part of this. There's when I write about it, when I talk about it, it also reminds me of when I named this podcast Mind Body Solution. I was thinking at that point, anyone who believes that there is no dichotomy might not listen to the podcast. So I
Right.
completely feel you where you're talking about matter became conscious and how this might affect the listener or the viewer, or the reader. But this book is actually it's a very, very good summary altogether in the beginning when you start to analyze the perspectives on consciousness. I think what many authors tend to do is either give a very poor summary or explanation, but you've managed to understand all these concepts very well. Do you think there's a reason that you've been able to understand each one? Maybe Mysterianism, idealism, materialism, all of these concepts. Do you find that your openness in essence has made you more receptive to these theories?
Yeah, I do think the
Long-winded question. Sorry about that.
no, it's great. Yeah, because I think I mentioned how I feel like you could say the unfolding of awakening of spirituality in life feels primary, and then this activity or writing ideas feel secondary. And I guess so you could say, if I was writing this from an ego place, then I think that creates things which say, oh, I don't want to focus on that because I want to give this impression of myself and this. I think I'm coming from a fundamental. I mentioned as well the desire to invite people into greater well-being and peacefulness without any bullshit, basically, without any games, without any nonsense. And so when that sincerity is there, I think that authenticity of of an open invitation to come into understanding and connection, then there's a thing of like, all right, well, let's do this kind of objectively. Let's work through each perspective and try and lay it out as clearly as I can because of that sincerity. So yeah, I think you're right. I think that is why it's the case. But I'm really glad that I've heard that multiple times. So that's another picture of the book. Even if you're not interested in my particular perspective, you could just enjoy learning about other perspectives if you read the first bit.
Yeah, it's a very good summary for anyone who's intrigued by the mind-body problem and this concept. I think it was chapter 1 where you really give a great analysis of the different perspectives of consciousness, and I really enjoyed that. Tell me,
And also, I mean, not so much for this audience, but I guess if you were going to gift it to someone else, like it can literally be, I think, the first book you've ever read on the mind or the brain or anything, because I try and start at the beginning. I mean, I'm not saying that I think this audience would still enjoy the book, but I meant that aspect of it could be really useful if you know anyone who you want to bring up to why this stuff's interesting, who isn't already on board with that.
Yeah, it's a perfect building block, and then obviously you go into the much deeper aspects into it. But as a baseline starting point, I think it's actually an excellent summary of these concepts
Oh, thank you.
altogether. So well done on that, because I know it's very difficult to capture the essence of this mind body problem. It's such a beautiful problem, and it's philosophy's most infamous problem. What about
Yeah,
it
yeah.
do you love so much?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the frustration of the gap, the sense of needing or having a real existential anxiety about wanting to know what's going on in reality, and seeing that there was a gap, and the gap suggests that you haven't got a full picture. There's something wrong with your picture. Um, so the fascination came from that desire for wholeness, I guess, the desire for reckoning with reality. So I guess that's what I loved about it, was just it's the place to zoom in on if you really want to understand reality.
Mm. And James, if you had to give anyone delving into this field a message for understanding the mind, matter, consciousness, life, what would it be?
I think it would be that my instinct is we don't need to be thinking so much about the neuroscience of consciousness. That's really useful as one exemplar of consciousness, systems that we know are conscious to study. But we should be, if we want to understand why it exists, we should be thinking about perhaps the biophysics of consciousness, or just complex system dynamics, like the physics of forms, something a lot more general and to do with complex forms rather than computations and brains.
Mm. And your channel, you explore this quite in depth. I'll put a link to that below as well. What is your overall goal?
Yeah, I think it's that unpacking, because this in its core, I think this vision of reality is quite simple, but it has many facets to it. So it's to yeah, I've had the pleasure of talking to lots of great thinkers on the related topics, and to flesh out how I see things, in case it's helpful for people. Uh, yeah, that's always been the goal.
It's quite cool because we're doing similar things from different perspectives, and we've chatted to quite a few similar guests, and this experience has been quite wonderful for me. I always feel super honored and privileged when I chat to people on this podcast. How has that been for your experience in this niche?
Yeah, it's been wonderful. I mean, yeah, you've had on really excellent guests, and the yeah, as have I. But it's felt very heartening, like that people are willing to give their time and to chat about these ideas. I feel very lucky to live in the age of podcasting, because like if this had happened in the 90s or something, you just would have struggled to have contact with these people. And the fact that you can just send an email, and the same day sometimes you're talking to someone whose work you really admire is really wonderful.
Yeah, and it's crazy how we actually missed each other so many times.
Yeah, yeah. We each contacted each other and missed each other's messages, and then eventually one of them landed.
It's another way that the universe just finds a way of working itself out. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
thank you so much for your contribution. This book's amazing, and I'm still going through it. It's because it's such a wonderful read, and it's such an easy read. Have you always been someone who enjoys writing, or has this just been something that you got lucky with?
No, I would say communications always come naturally. That
Mm.
yeah, I've really enjoyed reading nonfiction, and I never thought of myself as a writer, but I always thought of myself as a communicator. There's something, again, some deep desire for connection in terms of like bringing people into a common understanding. It's like almost like a peacemaker instinct of like, yeah, trying to, that's there for some reason. And so yeah, like writing it down was just another, instead of giving talks or doing podcasts, yeah, I think that communicative instinct was always there.
If you had to recommend the average listener of this podcast your favorite non-fiction and fiction book, what would those be?
That's interesting. I've got a toddler now, so it's been a while since I really sat down with a good with a good book, especially with fiction. Um, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, Incomplete Nature, is very related to the book, to my book. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful read. If you're interested in the mind body problem, uh, fiction. Nabokov was one of my favorites, as kind of lifelong favorites. Lolita is a truly incredible book. Um, I know people sometimes, given the subject matter, think that's a kind of weird book to recommend, but it is, he's a Russian who's writing in a second language, and it's his writing is incredible. So
That
anything by Nabokov.
that actually reminds me, because one of the questions I had for you was on Carlo's book, Helgoland, and the way you understand matter. Do you want to quickly touch on that and the way your
Yeah.
your interpretation of nature falls in place with this?
Absolutely. My computer's on low battery, so if I cut out, that'll be why. Just so you know. Yes, actually, Helgoland I definitely recommend as well. So that's this quantum mechanical relational view of reality where the things that we perceive as particles are actually just instances of interaction. So when you measure the spin of a particle, it's not that you exist and as an object, as a solid thing, and the particle exists as a solid thing, and you're both real, and it has a property, and that you look at that property and you measure it. Rather, there is existence interacting with itself through those embodiments, through this thing we call a body and that moment that we call a particle. And the observation of the spin is kind of what exists. It's a web of interactions, and then it's our minds that solidify that into a perception of solid objects. And we think, well, surely there's got to be a solid thing there, because at this scale, as a primate, that's how I perceive the world. But there's no reason to think that feeling of solid, substantial substance, objects generalizes to the fabric of reality. So I think the fabric of reality fits with Buddhism, in the sense of it being an empty, insubstantial web of relations, of interdependent occurrences. So you can imagine like the zero energy universe hypothesis, where you get positive energy and negative energy perfectly cancel each other out. So you get, in that way, you can think of starting with nothing, with zero energy. I mean, you get something from nothing by this flux where up is not down, hot is not cold. There isn't actually an averaged out thing there. You don't actually have to put anything into the system, any net energy, but you just have this polarization. This is kind of what a relational dynamic is. Everything's cashed out against everything else. And so you get a very complex form of relational flux that's always in change. I think that's what reality is. And I think our best physics is now pointing to that.
Well, James, thank you so much for your time. This is a wonderful book. I will definitely put a link, and I really appreciate your time and your efforts and your contributions to the field. So thanks so much for that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I appreciate your podcast. I really like what you're doing, and thanks for having me on.